To me, Dunkirk Spirit means people facing insurmountable odds and overcoming them.
Society needs these stories to come back to as reminders of what can be done in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds.
Chris could have made a completely conventional version of this film, but Chris did something truly revolutionary with it, almost an art movie, sort of in disguise as a studio movie.
Where are we going?
Dunkirk.
If we go there, we'll die.
My sincerest hope is that studios will look to a film like this and feel that they can make something as experimental and boundary-pushing as this film was.
There are 400,000 men trapped on a beach, their backs to the sea, the enemy closing in all around them. And it's just a matter of time before they face surrender or annihilation. The fact that this story does not end in either surrender or annihilation is what makes it one of the greatest stories in human history, and one which I've been wanting to tell for quite some time.
What I love about the film and what Chris did with it is that he completely subverted the genre.
He, I think, lights up the imagination that the audience will intuit.
The film is based on the evacuation of Dunkirk, where the British Army was stranded on the beach of Dunkirk.
The enemy tanks have stopped.
Why have they stopped?
Why waste precious tanks when they can pick us off from the air like fish in a barrel?
There was an incredible effort by the Navy, but also civilians, to come and rescue them from that beach.
About 800 small boats came from the south coast of England, not just the Navy, but what seemed to be the whole of England.
Chris had an extremely clear idea of how he wanted to achieve the telling of this story.
We have to go to Dunkirk. Ready on the stern line.
What are you doing? You know where we're going.
Into war, George.
The screenplay is the skeleton, and then you have to go through the process a few times to sort of start to understand what's going to get filled in, how it's going to grow with different people's input.
Through the way that Chris has constructed the screenplay and is directing it, the audience gets a unique perspective that the participants don't have.
The experiences that we've had on making the other films sort of all led up to us being able to make this film.
Chris is a master of making like a completely chess-moved script.
I remember you reading the script for Memento.
Oh, I know, I remember that very clearly.
Pages going back and then...
Yes, and I give feedback.
You give feedback, yes. Also known as a bucket of cold water, but,
It's the way it works.
Films need to tell very essential stories, mythical stories, an essential kind of experience.
His process is ultimately the same. He learns something from every film and he takes it and he uses that experience. It's all about going forward. It's always about expanding his vision.
To me, it's always very important to try and work with real things, real people, because I think that the effect on film is very enveloping and draws you into the story. It allows you to believe in the reality of what you're seeing.
Chris and Emma made the marvelous decision to go and film in Dunkirk.
With respect, with honor, to come to the real place.
We were very determined to try and be true to the actual reality of how young these people would have been when they went off to fight in this terrible conflict. Some of them were really just kids.
Originally, we had said that we weren't going to cast anyone familiar whatsoever because we wanted to have the freedom to cast whoever was right.
looking for someone who you immediately care about and you want them to survive.
Somebody needs to get off. Well volunteered. I don't need a volunteer. Move! Somebody's got to get off so the rest of us can live. Do you want to volunteer?
No. I'm going home.
And if this is a prize...
We really were talking about 17, 18, 19-year-old actors. You start exploding things around them, you're gonna get very real reactions.
There's certain planes that come down and fire at us. Bombs are going off left, right, and center.
This thing blew up and it's going off behind your head.
I think at this stage everybody knows kind of Chris's aesthetic and his philosophy. He believes that the audience react to something in a more truthful way if it happens in camera.
Dunkirk is a huge story, and it demanded an enormous canvas. We shot the entire film using large format film.
Doing as much in camera as we possibly could, particularly in IMAX. Audiences feel what it's like to be in that situation.
It's coming back round. It's coming back round!
In approaching this story, eventually what I decided was important was the experience of it from the viewpoint of the people really involved with it. Soldiers on the beach, the civilians coming over in the boats to help, the Spitfire pilots in the air above.
Part of that is finding the reality of what it was really like to be there. And the idea of telling the story from a very subjective point of view, putting yourself into the mind of a person who's involved, that becomes key to telling the story for me.
We straight away started talking about a big format, especially IMAX. On an intuitive level, it felt like a very honest way to tell this story.
The huge challenge of the IMAX format is the size and weight of the cameras. But the reason we were shooting on IMAX film is the immersive quality of the image is second to none. So our feeling was if we could find a way to do it physical, the payoff would be well worth it.
They're very loud cameras, and so it was very difficult to use them for big dialogue scenes.
In order for us to record dialogue, we figured out that 65mm would be a great sort of replacement format for the 35mm that we've been using before on Interstellar.
The thing about the IMAX format is it's based on creating such a high quality image that you get a very visceral and tactile sense of being there as things are unfolding.
You're so in it with the characters. There's really no barrier between you and them. Your relationship with the characters is a much more intimate one. You're in the experience with them. And I think that the incredible achievement that Chris has had with this film is to engage audiences in a completely new way.
We had various tracking vehicles and so forth to move across the sand, but ultimately I think for the type of filming that we wanted to do in those situations, there's really no better solution than handheld camera.
I really wanted to make that camera work as any other camera you would use. You know, handheld and underwater in a very sort of intuitive and impulsive way that you can use a film camera.
They're very large, you know, and heavy, and he's got to do it, you know, in the water with stuff going on around him, with wind, with whatever the situation is. It's physically challenging for the cinematographer to be able to do that.
We made it work, you know, and we made it work because we just had the feeling we owe it to the subject to just put the best format to the story.
One of the moments in the film which really sort of resonates for me every time I see the shot is the moment where the Moonstone sails alongside the big destroyer with all the hundreds of soldiers on it. I think it's an incredible visual that sums up the idea that just regular people managed to really make a difference for the military. That's one of the things that's most unusual, I think, and exciting about this story.
You should be at home!
Well, there won't be any home if we allow a slaughter across the channel.
The guys would go out on this boat and, you know, literally the camera crew and a limited number of people would be in this small yacht, basically, all day.
It's a real boat. We went out there and we shot it for real. Voyager and I both felt that the claustrophobia of the real boat, even for the interiors, rather than building sets, just being there, that sense of claustrophobia needed to come across in the filmmaking.
The Moonstone had all these challenges, very little space, very little crew, you know, will to have all those cameras in there. Just practically working it with the actors, you know, because there's waves. It was not always easy.
It's kind of confined the space and brought us all close together.
We're talking about hand-holding an IMAX camera, which is, you know, or worse, the 65.
Basically, you've got a 70-pound weight falls in and you go in with it, you're both going to the bottom of the bloody ocean.
Sometimes we shot to 65mm, which is a beast, and then we would change it to IMAX, which is a beast as well. So we would have to transfer one camera set off and the other camera set on, and we had to be into the waves in order to create a relative stability.
There's man in the water!
It's very challenging. There's a very sort of aggressive short waves.
Seeing Hoyte holding that camera, particularly when it was rocky and we were rocking back and forth like this, just to see them keeping the camera on a man's shoulder. I don't think that camera was ever designed to be held up.
With a great handheld cameraman like Pointer, that is your most stable camera platform. That's your most versatile camera platform on a moving boat.
Being out on the water on the Moonstone, you're being thrown from one side to the other, people flying at you from all angles because the water's so hectic. That was where we did the real thing, and it's going to show in the film, you know, the authenticity of it.
With IMAX, you let the audience find what's in the frame, you let them experience what's in the frame for that little bit longer. And so you have to find other ways in which to affect the pacing and rhythm of the film.
Chris had a concept for a way that music would be able to amp up the tension of the overall story of the film.
We wanted to only have the music play the visceral sense of tension in the film.
You've got like a tone that is continually ascending, even though it can't continuously ascend, but it feels like a magnetic drive that pulls you forward.
Hans managed to put together a very long tempo map for us so that we could actually cut with some sense of how the rhythm of the music was going to work.
The only way to do it was to make a bold and experimental film. This turned, I think, into the hardest project we ever worked on.
The score, I think, is a very integral part of why when you watch the film, you sort of get to the end and feel like you've run a marathon.
I wanted to try and have a series of more and more intense set pieces that are interacting. So as one storyline is climaxing, the other one's just beginning. And in that way, try and put the audience into a very heightened state for as long as possible.
To do justice to the epic scale of the event that was Dunkirk, you need to see it from a vantage point that perhaps only cinema can give you, which means sometimes being high in the sky, sometimes it means traveling along the beaches.
And as well as all the equipment, of course, there are thousands of extras.
Thousands, push their way on this little sliver out into the ocean and basically stood there completely vulnerable to aerial assault.
The Mole was majorly significant because this is where all the destroyers pulled the majority, large numbers of the troops.
The Mole is a very distinctive feature of Dunkirk, and we had to rebuild the Mole to make it look a little bit more the way it was in 1940. That was a pretty huge undertaking. It's an incredible visual because it's sort of this very narrow breakwater that goes out a long way into the water.
It's this kilometre-long sort of bridge to nowhere, this breakwater that these guys were all thousands of guys queuing up on. And there for days, hours and hours, just not knowing at what point they get to the front of the queue, and if they get to the front of the queue, whether there's a boat there or not. What we needed to do was reproduce the concrete and wood structure, this white structure that had been there originally.
Normally when you're building a set, you're just building it's not styrofoam, but it's not meant to last. We had to construct something that had to be both structurally sound and take, the pounding of the ocean.
Swing of the tide, as indeed in the original events and the story of the film, is a major, major factor because the swing of the tide is colossal at Dunkirk.
The natural elements were the most challenging thing that we came up against in pretty much every situation.
It was one of the hardest things I think we've ever built. So, of course, we got it all built, and while we were shooting, we got hit by some pretty heavy weather. The force of some of those high waves would actually get up onto the deck.
First 2 weeks of shooting, we had huge storms, and it was wet, it was raining, it was cold, but we were shooting our best material there, We were always struggling with those elements, and the tide would always come in faster than you would think. Chris and I were like, oh, let's go and shoot, let's go, let's try to shoot in this. It's a very extreme sort of extra element to have with you, and that always takes you by surprise.
We ended up on various occasions coming in the morning and finding that bits of our Mole had been washed away overnight.
And we were basically rebuilding the set while we were shooting something else.
That's very much the Nolan way. We're out here and we're out here to work. We're here to sort of live it a bit more.
Being out on the Mole when it's windy and rainy and you're kind of getting lashed and battered is quite trying. In a good way, though. It's going to look amazing.
That's one of the golden rules. You just keep shooting. You don't shut down, you keep shooting.
And I think what you get in a Nolan film is a level of authenticity that the actors respond to very strongly, the crew responds to very strongly.
That becomes the key to telling the story for me, so they can believe in the experience they're seeing in a tactile sense.
We then had to deal with the issues that the water threw at us. That was an enormous challenge.
After yesterday's losses, it's one ship on the mole at a time.
They need to send more ships. Every hour the enemy pushes closer. They've activated the small vessels pool.
Small vessels?
It's the list of civilian boats for requisition.
Civilian? We need destroyers.
We had as many as 62 vessels on one day, with major logistical hurdles.
Safety boats, camera boats, makeup and hair. And every time that you shot in a certain direction, all those boats would have to move so that they were out of the shot. And that was an incredible thing to get a glimpse of.
We have this whole section of the movie that takes place on the English Channel. We're not the first movie to be on the water. We certainly wouldn't be the last. But the common thinking is you go into a tank, you get a green screen, you build all your ships. Chris wanted to try to do everything practically, and that becomes challenging. We brought our Marine department in and talked to them about the traditional ways of doing that.
Every time we went out on the water with a group of people, we learned something about how we were going to approach this.
It showed how hard it is actually to do a film on water. It is very difficult.
We were very lucky that we had a fantastic Marine coordinator in Neil Andrea, who, I mean, I don't even know how he did what he had to do in this film.
Neil really managed to put together a very, very complex and ambitious set of circumstances, very large number of boats out on the water at the same time, in some challenging conditions.
We had boats on the beach. We had boats coming back from the beach. We had little ships heading towards the beach. We had a destroyer with 2 full-size tugs, keeping it in position, full of extras. We had patrol boats, minesweepers, torpedo boats in the 30-meter range, zipping around on the middle level. And then behind that, we had our full-size minesweepers and other military ships.
There's so many different assets that were in these shots at the same time. Ships, planes overhead, interacting, multiple ships, camera ships, over, guys in the water, all these things kind of working at the same time.
It was controlled chaos. We had bad weather from the start, and it never stopped. The wind would hit 30 knots on a pretty regular basis, and it would create these waves that had a super short period, which means they were super close together. And it was just really destructive on boats and equipment and people, and he was just banging those boats around.
Sometimes we'd set stuff up, and then at the last minute, the conditions would change really rapidly.
If the weather switched or something, moved slightly, you had to just pull the plug, call it off, and reset and make everything happen, which we did plenty of times.
The fire on the water, that was quite a challenge. We had these massive barges with liquid propane tanks that we had to take out miles out.
We built enough planes with the intention of crashing as many as we could.
We had a scene where the Spitfires launched off of a barge, supposed to skip, kind of land into the water. It launched off the barge okay. It hit and then quickly went to the bottom before anybody could get to it with an IMAX camera attached to it.
So if you ask any of the Marine Department people, it's probably one of the most taxing and hardest movies on water that they've ever done.
Little Ships Week, which in terms of a Marine movement and that Marine work was certainly one of the bigger water days in filmmaking. I remember at the end of the day, I was dizzy and I was standing next to Nilo Otero and standing next to Chris, and we called cut. And I remember Chris just kind of calmly looked over at Nilo and I. Chris goes, "That was good." And Nilo and I just looked at each other and just sat back. We just started laughing. I was just I remember coming to my hotel room that night and just collapsing. Typically, when you would see a film like this, you would look in the background and you could clearly see that it was VFX. It was real from sand to over a mile offshore. It was just layer and layer of ships and all of these boats working together in unison.
Neil found ways to safely do that, which is not easy with a large group of boats and a large crew out there.
That was part of Chris's talent, is that he knew exactly what he wanted.
We were able to get a wide range of shots to really try and communicate the experience of the characters interacting with the environment.
From a production point of view, it's exhilarating because you're standing there and you're looking at the thing unfold in front of you.
It becomes absolutely part of how your character develops when you're actually in the environment and it's happening to you.
Lead fuel for 40-minute fighting time over Dunkirk. And keep an eye on that gauge, even when it gets lively. Save enough to get back.
It's very helpful to have a real Spitfire or two and a Messerschmitt fly low over your boat. The force of that engine.
It was just insane to watch these, Spitfires feet above your head. When do you ever get to do that as a human being? And playing those situations, literally all you had to do was watch what was happening.
It's so easy and so pleasurable when there's less to try and imagine.
When you stand on a battleship, which is already crazy, and then a Spitfire goes by you.
The audience will believe. I think they will just know, and then they'll feel it.
That's the reality that we want to give the audience so that they can feel that they're there.
Chris wanted to strap IMAX cameras to Spitfire, so we had to figure out how to do that.
Finding platforms to work with those cameras, including engineering and building them to actually attach to airplanes. Well, it hasn't been done, and it wasn't simple.
We started to invent stuff to make it possible for us to put the camera on planes and to start flying with it, just as they did in the old days.
We can mount a camera exterior. Looks forward through the cowling, through the propeller. It's great for a dogfighting sequence, chasing the Messerschmitt. I get to shoot him down. He blows on the smoke. I fly right through his smoke. And so that's real action, in-your-face kind of stuff. That camera also turns around, points the other direction, so they can chase me trying to shake the Messerschmitt as he's running around on my tail. On the left side is a camera mount that looks diagonally into the cockpit we use for the actor when he's there.
We have spent a lot of time really working with the Panavision guys, really, and the IMAX guys, really trying to come up with interesting ways to be able to get a lens where the head of the pilot would be and look around and see what that pilot would see, which was an extremely difficult thing to do.
Hoyte developed a special lens.
The ultimate thing is to make it look like it's shot on a GoPro, but with the quality of an IMAX camera. So we had lenses that could pivot and rotate around its own axis, that we could put an IMAX body somewhere and then have a lens pivoting itself, giving much more flexibility and much more turnability in a very confined space.
And that allows us to set the camera right where the actor's eye or head would have been.
It was particularly important when we were trying to integrate the action with the boats in the water. And you're trying to coordinate an entire gag or entire stunt or interaction of multiple airplanes with a ship that's in the sea.
To stage a huge event below, like there's the fire at sea, and have that all coordinate with each other.
That becomes the hardest form of coordination that we had to deal with. We've done a lot of work integrating ground-based vehicles, fast-moving cars, helicopters, for example. But air-to-air, the scale, size, and the speeds at which things happen, very, very much more challenging than what we've done in the past.
The Spitfires will go upwards of 200 knots, so we couldn't keep speed with them. In order to actually be in formation with them, we're flying over the English Channel with them. We had to use another airplane, and I had to find a way to basically mount the cameras.
We've used an Aerostar airplane with a IMAX camera on the front and the tail of the aircraft.
We have mounted cameras, so basically wherever I point the airplane, that's where the camera's going.
When you work with Chris, you're there where the camera is. And if the camera is 1,000 foot up in the air, upside down, that's where you will be. I would say almost every shot that's in the film, up there, Chris and I were there.
No one has ever put an IMAX camera on a fixed wing and done air-to-air at 200 miles an hour.
We really wanted to be able to get our actors up into the air. The shots in the film where you see one of the actors in a Spitfire, just beyond them, another Spitfire.
That's the single coolest thing I've ever been involved in, is when you can look over and there is a Spitfire banking around next to you. We're flying over where it happened. Ridiculous. It was absolutely insane.
There's really no way that you could create that in a computer.
That intimate physicality, that tiny cockpit.
He's on me!
To be in there for an hour or two. We really focused on that as being one of the most important aspects of the film. Putting the audience in that seat.
I'm on him.
Which was an extremely difficult thing to do.
You see these, amazing airplanes in beautiful natural light through the canopy of the Spitfire and the other plane and the sky, shot on IMAX entirely in camera. It's not something you've seen before.
put yourself in a seat in an IMAX theater and you look at it, you see what it does to you. You see what it does to you emotionally. You see how appealing an image like that can be. You start to find ways to, bring it with you on the set and to work with it.
Then the trick was to match into that photography with the stuff that we needed to do on the ground, whether shots of the instrument panel, pickups of the actors, and what have you.
There was some footage that we weren't going to be able to achieve in a real plane, and so there was a certain amount that we had to shoot on a set.
So we basically took the point of view of not using any green screens or blue screens and trying to shoot things in such a way that there was always a real background, real water, an appropriate altitude, real sky, and natural lighting.
We built a gimbal that we could counterweight for the weight of the cockpit and everything, and then it could be operated by hand.
Bandit, 1 o'clock, break.
For the most part, Chris and I operated just by adding and subtracting weight for the camera or different positions, and we were able to pitch and yaw and roll.
Thing of beauty, it was a thing that could rotate in 2 axes in the orientation as the plane goes. And I think the success of that gimbal for me is still that it was a hand-operated, not machine-operated, man-operated piece of equipment.
That's the more important tonal authenticity. Put the audience right there and give them that experience. We had naval destroyers, we had real little ships there, boats that had actually come across. We were shooting at the same time of year, in the same place that they came to. We had rebuilt the mole, with the damage of the town, the smoke for real, to be able to fly a real airplane, rather than making a perfect CG replica. It felt quite extraordinary.
What is very gratifying to me is that the notion of Dunkirk spirit has now extended to a whole world of people that didn't know what that was.
It's a Christopher Nolan film. I mean, it's exciting and it's moving and entertaining.
The thing that Chris does in his movies, which I really appreciate, is that when you watch them in the cinema, you're experiencing something that you couldn't experience anywhere else.
You're right there with those guys. You're right there with the kids. You ask yourself the question, what would I do?
One of the reasons that I think the film resonated very much with audiences is that I think ultimately the story is about what communities of people can achieve if they put their minds to it.
What do you see?
Home.
Dunkirk is the ultimate sort of life or death race against time. That's what the reality of the situation was, and so we've really tried to throw the audience into that. We want to give people a really intense ride as they go through it, put people there and allow them to feel what that experience would have been like.
Old school directing. He's actually making the film. He is the definition of a filmmaker.
The Dunkirk Spirit, rated PG-13.
Hey, Vali here with a top earnings movie fact for you. Did you know that the top 3 highest grossing movies in the United States for 2017 were female-led, female-centric blockbuster offerings? These top 3 films are Star Wars: The Last Jedi with over 400 million, Wonder Woman with 430 million, and Beauty and the Beast with 504 million. Now, with the exception of American Sniper in 2015, it's the 5th year in a row where the top domestic earner was a major movie that happened to have a female lead or female leads. Yes. Do you agree with these results? Let me know below. And remember, we publish new videos every day, so be sure to subscribe for more great content. Bye.